Welcome to Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. We're going to continue studying Judges under the theme, We Need a Godly Leader. This is the big second section of Judges 17 to 21, which describe the religious and moral apostasy that occurred before David the king came and united the nation and reestablished a central place of worship. That's why you have these key verses right here, like in Judges 17:6, which says, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes." That's repeated at the very conclusion of this section. The author is looking back. The author writes probably during the first part of David's reign, and he makes this statement describing the time of Judges, that every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Notice he did not say that which was wrong in his own eyes. That's basically moral relativism. You contrast modernism with postmodernism. You remember the modernist fundamentalist controversy early in the 20th century. You had liberals like Harry Emerson Fosdick, who denied, for example, the virgin birth. Then you had those who became known as fundamentalists, J. Gresham Machen, who was a theological scholar, defended the virgin birth. Each one said, "I'm right, you're wrong." But in modern or postmodernism, you're right if you think it's right. There is no right and wrong. And that amazingly goes back to the book of Judges. And that's what is happening, as we're going to see in this section. So Judges needs a godly leader such as David, because the tribal leaders failed to defeat the enemy. Joshua went in, as we know, defeated the major strategic cities and left it up to the tribes to clean up or get rid of the other Canaanites, those who were doctrinally and morally impure and a threat to God's people. But the judges also failed to stop apostasy. And now we come to this section, and we learn that the Levites failed to obey the law and stop apostasy. The Levites were like the full-time Christian servants of that time. So what we have, let's break this down. We have religious apostasy in chapter 17 and 18, where we see a disloyalty to God and family. We're going to look at individual apostasy in chapter 17, societal apostasy in chapter 18. Individual apostasy, if not checked, becomes societal apostasy. But then the second section is moral apostasy, or a disloyalty to God and family. Again, so moral apostasy rides piggyback on religious apostasy. You depart doctrinally from God, then there will be this moral departure. Again, we have individual apostasy affecting society or societal apostasy. But in the book of Ruth, you have this contrast, loyalty to God and family in the days of apostasy. She stands out as the great exception during this very apostate time. So we're going to focus on this part right here. We need a godly king because the Levites failed to obey. A Levite is going to be prominent throughout this section. This probably takes place during the time of Judge Othniel. Jonathan was Moses' grandson. This is chapter 18. Chapter 18, verse 30. This is the Levite that we're we're going to look at in chapter 17 and 18. But here he is named. And the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom being one of the sons of Moses, which makes this even more tragic, that a grandson of Moses is a part of the apostasy in the Promised Land. Religious apostasy, chapter 17 and 18, where you have a disloyalty to God and a disloyalty to family. We're going to look at, first of all, chapter 17, individual apostasy, chapter 17, 1. And there was a man of Mount Ephraim whose name was Micah. And he said unto his mother, the 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you, about whom you cursed or pronounced a curse on, and spoke also in my ears, behold, the silver was with me, I took it. Here's this disloyalty to family and to God. This son steals his mother's 1,100 shekels is a lifetime of income, basically. He steals it from his mother. And only when she pronounces a curse upon him does he become afraid of God honoring that curse, does he return it. But the mother blesses him for it. And his mother said, blessed be you of the Lord, my son. And when he had restored the 1,100 shekels of silver, the mother said, I have wholly dedicated the silver unto the Lord from my hand for my son to make. Here, she takes part of this money, she dedicates it to the Lord to do what? To make a graven image. And molten image. She says, now therefore I will restore unto you. So here's the worship of idols in chapter 17, 1-6. Verse 4, yet he restored the money unto his mother, and his mother took 200 shekels of silver. That's several $1,000s of money today. And gave it to the founder, that is the one who would make these images, who made thereof a graven image and a molten image, and they were in the house of Micah. Here's Israel's first image worship since Exodus 32, when Moses was up on the mount and Aaron and Israel created this golden calf and immorally were involved in worship. God dealt with that. But this idolatry is during the time of Judges. Here we see the here we see the influence of the Canaanites on God's people. That's why God said, destroy the Canaanites with their false religions, with their false gods. This is idolatry by the Levites before the king comes. Idolatry worships its own creation. Just think about that. You're worshiping something that cannot see, cannot hear, cannot speak, cannot respond. It is your creation instead of worshiping the Creator. What a cheap substitute. But there's also disobedience to God's word. Verse 5. And the man Micah had an house of gods and an ephod and a teraphim, and consecrated one of his sons to become his priest. Well, he's disobeying God's word. First of all, there's disobedience. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. But now he has made one of his sons priest. When it was spelled out in the Old Testament, only the descendants of Aaron could be priests. But look in verse 6. Here's the reason, and here's that repetition of that theme verse. Verse 6. In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. God was still their king whom they rejected. There is theft here in this religious apostasy, worshiping other gods. There is idolatry and there is disobedience. God commanded to worship in his house, but Micah is setting up his house as a shrine and a place of worship. Deuteronomy chapter 12 specifically says, go to the place that God has ordained to worship. Worship in his house, not your house. That's what Micah was doing. And you just think about the attitude today about the local church. We know there's this criticism among different groups about the local church, the institutional church, because of its faults. And there are faults. There's plenty of faults. But there's faults in every other institution that God has created. There's faults in the marriage, but we should not abandon the institution of marriage. There's faults in the government. We should not abandon government and have anarchy because there are faults. We should work to fix those faults. And there's faults in the church. But the church is the institution God has ordained. I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I was talking to one young father who every night prays with his wife and little girl, reads the Bible to them, and I commended him, but he does not go to church. And I told him, I was very proud of what he was doing, but I said, this needs to be a part of your life. This needs to be a part of that little girl that you're raising. She needs to be brought up in God's house. And he said, what I'm doing is better than going and sitting in a building for 1 hour on Sunday morning. That was his rationalization. But that's not true. New Testament says, forsake not the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is. It's there in that corporate worship that we sing his praises corporately. We hear his word taught and preached. If God has ordained marriage, if God has ordained government, and if he has ordained the local church, even with its faults, we should go to his house and not just stay in our house. There's individual apostasy. There's worship of idols. And then there's the worship of money. Let's look how this story continues in verse 7. Judges 17:7. And there was a young man out of Bethlehem, Judah, of the family of Judah, who was a Levite, and he sojourned there. Okay, what are we studying here? We're saying the theme is we need a godly leader such as David, because the Levites have failed. Well, here's the Levite. Here's the first Levite. So he leaves his place of residence, and he sojourns, verse 8, and the man departed out of the city of Bethlehem, Judah, to sojourn where he could find a place, and he came to Mount Ephraim, to the house of Micah, so he sojourned. And Micah said unto him, where did you come from? And he said, I am a Levite of Bethlehem, Judah, and I go to sojourn where I may find a place. In other words, he's looking for employment. Verse 10, Micah said unto him, dwell with me, and be unto me a father and a priest, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver by the year, and a suit of apparel. I'll give you a clothing allowance, and victuals, give you a food allowance. And the Levi went in. But again, this is disobeying the Lord. It was not through Gratian that there were to be priests. This is a descendant of Gratian. We learn from chapter 18, verse 30, it was from Aaron that there were to be priests. The Levites were to assist the priests. So we see once more disobedience to God. And so the Levite goes in and he serves out of God's will. But he does this for money. There's that Numbers 3 and verse 10 passage. Numbers 3, verse 10. And you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall wait on their priest's office. He goes on to talk about the other sons of Moses, Gershom, Kohath, and Merari. They all had other duties, but they were not to be priests. So here is disobedience to God's will. Here was Jonathan, a Levite, not living in a Levitical city. Perhaps he said, I just need more money. He's out of God's will. Jonathan will leave this position for more money. If you look over in chapter 18, when he is offered to be priest of the entire tribe of Dan, well, he takes it. So what is this guy doing? What is this Levite doing? He is serving for money. I put this passage down here, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 and 3. These are the qualifications of a pastor for today. 1 Timothy 3:1, this is a true saying, faithful saying. If a man desire the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy. And so here is, we see this human nature that does not change, going all the way back to the Old Testament. We don't serve for money. Sometimes I tell my pastoral students, if you want to pastor for money, you need to change to the denomination of the Presbyterians. You'll get a lot better pay there than you will for Baptists. But we're not in it for the money. As society goes, so goes, as the home goes, so goes society. Vance Havner once said, he said, don't worry about their taking the Bibles out of the schools. This goes back years, before some of you may remember. He said, don't worry about when they took Bibles out of public schools. They get free Bibles in prison. What is his point? His point was, when we depart from the Lord, it will affect society. And that's what we're going to look at in chapter 18. So let me just stop right there, and then we will come back and look at chapter 18. Welcome back to Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. We're going to continue on in this section, Judges 17 and 18, where the theme is we need a godly leader based on these two verses, primarily, Judges 17:6 and 21:25. In those days there was no king in Israel, and every person did that which was right in his own eyes. There was individual apostasy in chapter 17 by that Levite. That's who we are focusing on here. The tribal leaders failed, the judges failed, and now the Levites have fallen. This individual Levite in chapter 17 is going to influence an entire tribe or society. in chapter 18. Societal apostasy follows individual apostasy. As goes the home, so goes the society. Again, this was God's first institution in Genesis 1 and 2. And Satan came immediately in Genesis chapter 3 and attacked it and caused the fall of man into sin. The attack has been persistent ever since. Here we see the consequences of that. There's idolatry by the tribe of Dan before the king comes, the Danites. This would be that southern tribe. You hear sometimes from Dan to Beersheba, from Dan in the south to Beersheba in the north. Dan was in the south, and the tribe of Dan was discontent. Look in chapter 18, verse 1. In those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of Dan sought them an inheritance to dwell therein. So we saw that same verse, or similarly stated, in chapter 17, verse 6. There was no king in Israel. What was the result of no godly leader? Individual apostasy. But another result of no godly leader is societal apostasy, and that is Dan. Dan is discontent with what they have, and so they're going to move north. Verse 2. And the children of Dan sent out of their family 5 men from their coasts, from their borders, men of valor, men from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. And they said unto them, Go search this land. And when they came to the mount of Ephraim, they came to the house of Micah. Just by chance, we would say they came to the house of Micah. That's where the Levite is. So this is going to tie these two stories together. The Danites send out tribes or spies. It sort of reminds us of Moses sending out spies into the promised land to take what God had given them. But Moses' motives were pure. The motives of the Danites is not pure. But they happened to come to the house of Micah as they traveled north. Verse 3. And when they were by the house of Micah, they knew the voice of the young man, the Levite. And they turned to him and said unto him, Why are you here? And basically he says, I'm here because they hired me as a priest. And so in verses 5 and 6, they say, well, can you ask God if he will bless us? Or if it's God's will for us to go find another place that is not God's inheritance for us in essence. And what does Jonathan do? He says, sure. God's blessings on you. So here's a preacher who preaches what they want to hear. He doesn't preach against sin. He's like prosperity preachers today. They preach what people want to hear. They do not preach on sin. And Jonathan is really just like a forerunner. The Danites pursue ease rather than God's will. So what do? They go north, verse 7. And then the 5 men departed and came into Laish. Now Laish is this little city that has no protection. It's just there minding its own business, not bothering anyone, making a good life and living. They're prospering. And so what do the Danites say? They are easy prey. So these men, go back to the leaders. Verse 9, and they say to the leaders of the Danites, arise, that we may go up against them, for we have seen the land, and behold, it is very good, and you are still. Don't be slothful to go, to enter, to possess the land. That sounds like what Moses was telling, Moses and Joshua were telling Israel, possess the land that God has given you. They're giving this vocabulary that sounds like God's will. But the motive behind Joshua going into the land is because God commanded them to do that and take that land as the promised land, guaranteed by God all the way back in Genesis 12, 15, and 17. Look in verse 16. When you go, you shall come unto a people secure and a large land, for God has given it into your hands. That's what Joshua told the children of Israel back in Joshua chapter 1. Again, they're using this Christianese. They're using this biblical language to justify doing wrong. They are pursuing ease. They're unwilling to stay where God had them and clean up, get rid of all the Canaanites in that tribe. No, they want a place of ease and comfort and easy living. Now, there is a time for ease and rest, right? At the end of every day, we need ease and rest. As a matter of fact, David in Psalm 104 praises God for the nighttime. And I often think of that verse when, after I have worked hard to the point of exhaustion, and I know some of you think that way as well. You have worked to the point of exhaustion. You hit that bed and you are thanking God for the rest. And then there's that 1 day a week that we should rest. 6 days shall you labor and then rest 1 day. We're not under the law, but I think that's a principle that we can apply. We're not machines. We need that daily rest. And then we also need just additional rest periodically. Remember, Jesus said unto his disciples, come ye yourselves apart and rest a while. We call that vacation. But we don't worship rest. We don't worship ease. That's not what we live for. That's what the Danites were pursuing, rather than God's will. They worship idols, they worship money, and they worship ease. So the Danites steal idols and a false priest. That's verses and a false priest. That's that Levi. That's verses 11 to 21. The Danites take all the idols of Micah and his priest. And the priest sort of objected at the beginning, verse 18. And these men, the Danites, had 600 soldiers standing outside the house. And these went into the house of Micah and gathered the carved images, the ephod, the teraphim, the molten image. And they said then said the priest unto them, what are you doing? And they said, put your hand on your mouth and come and be our priest. Would you rather be the priest of this family? Or would you rather be the priest of an entire tribe and make more money? Verse 20, and the priest's heart was glad. Darrell Bock said this: the question the Danites posed to him, the Levite, is asked every day by pastoral search committees. These are committees looking for a pastor for the church, and they ask this question to the candidate: which is better, to be the pastor of a small family or to be a pastor of a mega church? And the contemporary problem, the contemporary problem of ambition and opportunism in the ministry has at least a 3,000-year history, Darrell Bock says. And so, what is our motive? It cannot be greed, right? It cannot be greed. But we see greed just saturating this story. The Danites were discontent. The Danites pursue ease rather than God's will. The Danites steal idols and a false priest. The Danites reveal the emptiness of idolatry and what they cause. Look in verse 21. So Micah finds out what's happened. He takes off after the Danites. Verse 23. And they cried unto the children of Dan, that is Micah and neighbors who went with him. And they turned their faces and said unto Micah, What is bothering you that you come with such a company, just a few? And Micah said, You have taken away my gods, which I have made. What a pathetic statement. What a revelation of the emptiness of idolatry. You've taken away the God that I made. Well, the God we worship made us in his image. What a contrast. But worshiping anyone, anything, rather than the one true God, leaves this emptiness, leaves us with despair. So he has to turn back because obviously he cannot fight against such an army. The Danites promoting dishonoring godly forebears. This Levite who joined them, we learn in verse 30, the children of Dan set up the graven image, and Jonathan, there's the name of the Levite, the son of Gershom. Son may mean descendant and not necessarily son of or Gresham or grandson of Moses here, but in either case, it does not matter. This descendant of Moses, who led Israel out of Egypt to the border of the promised land, and then tapped Joshua as his successor to lead Israel into the promised land. This descendant now is dishonoring his forebears, primarily Moses. We need to think of the consequences of our actions, not only personally, but for my family. And what I am doing, will it bring dishonor upon God? That's the greatest thought that we should consider. But will it bring dishonor upon the name of Moses in this case, or the name of maybe my godly parents, the grandparents? I think of graduates, even of our school, who came to our school, sent here by their parents who were graduates of this school. I've been around long enough to see that. I have taught children of students that I've had, and that's an incredible blessing. But some of those students go into other religions separate from their parents, religions that are not true to Scripture, religions that teach works for salvation, for example, breaking the heart of those parents, dishonoring the Moses in their life. That's something that we should think about. The Danites established a worship center with stolen idols. Look in verse 31. And they set up Micah's graven image, which he made, and all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh. Shiloh is not that far away. That's where the Ark of the Covenant is. That's the place of worship. Again, we worship in God's house, not our house. But the Danites have set up this place of worship with these stolen idols. Someone said that's like starting a church with stolen pews or stolen stackable chairs, hymnals, and a Bible or audio equipment, video equipment to start a church. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Not what was right in God's eyes, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes. So we see religious apostasy in chapters 17 and 18. And this apostasy will continue in chapters 19 and 21 that we will look at next.